Do you have a 48 needle circular knitting machine and would like to knit a sweater on it? This is my tutorial on how I made the No-Frills Sweater on my 48 needle Sentro knitting machine. This is a basic beginner sweater that I made. It's the first one that I have ever done. And it's a beginner sweater because it is very basic, and you also don't need to know how to hand crochet or hand knit. We're just going to be using our 48 needle Sentro knitting machine, a mattress stitch, and a slip stitch, and I will show you how to do those with this tutorial. So let's get going on some supplies you are going to need. Of course, you're going to need the 48 needle circular knitting machine, or the King Addie would work as well. For yarn, I use 6 skeins of the Caron Simply Soft yarn in red. Color for the sweater, you can see that below here. You will also want waste yarn. This is extra yarn the same or similar weight as your project yarn, but in a very contrasting color. I used Big Twist, value brand. For a crochet hook, you will need a 4.5 millimeter hook if you're using the same yarn as I am, scissors, some stitch markers, a large eye needle, as well as, if you want to block your project, blocking foam pads and pins. So the first thing we need to make is the tubes for our sweater. I am in tube mode, and we want to start with our waste yarn, and we want to cast on. I like to do between 5 and 10 rows for our cast on and cast off yarn. This is not our project yarn. If you need a more in-depth tutorial on how to cast on, cast off, and make tubes on your Sentro circular knitting machine, go into my bio, and I have the playlist Sentro Knitting Machine 101. It will give you slower, in-depth tutorials on how to cast on, how to cast off, make tubes, and use waste yarn. So check out those videos, and also I have linked in the video description another video that I have some extra information and some lessons learned for this sweater as well. So once our waste yarn is done, we have between that 5 and 10 rows, we're going to remove the waste yarn, and now we're going to add our project yarn. And for your project yarn, you either want to start or end your tubes with a very long tail for your yarn. And this is going to help mattress stitch down all the tubes together so you don't have to add any more yarn. It's already connected to your tubes, which is really nice. So just remember to either start it with a really long piece. Probably a good rule of thumb would be like twice around the circumference of your machine. Throw that in the middle when you start, and then you'll have enough yarn to mattress stitch everything down. And you won't have to knot more yarn onto your tubes to mattress stitch them together. For our tubes, we're making a medium size sweater. We need a total of 6 tubes. If you want it larger or smaller, check out that video I have linked in the description about different sizes and how many tubes to use. But for this tutorial, we're making the medium size. So for your torso, you're going to need a total of 4 tubes. 2 of them are going to be at 250 rows and 2 at 125 rows. And again, for these tubes, we want to start and stop it with waste yarn. So once you have all of your rows done on the tube that you are making, we want to then get your waste yarn again and add it back on to the machine and crank out again 5 to 10 rows, and then remove the yarn from the yarn holder, crank it around 2 more times, and the project will fall off the machine. The waste yarn is just a placeholder to hold your project yarn in place until we stitch it together. So again, we've just done your tubes for your torso. That was 2 at 250 rows plus waste yarn, and then 2 at 125 rows plus waste yarn. And then you're going to want to do the tubes for your arms. Your arms on this tutorial I only did as a single layer, and 125 rows was too long. I would say do between 80 and 100 rows, depending on if you want it to come to about to your wrist, or if you want it slightly longer, you can do a few more. But 80 would probably be a good place to start. Again, see the video I've linked below in the description about arm length. If you want your arms to be a double layer and not a single layer, you want to do 4 tubes, all with the same amount of rows. I only did 2 tubes, and it's just a single layer because I ran out of yarn. So you would probably need at least 7 skeins of yarn if you want to do a double layer for your arms as well, because you're doing 2 additional tubes. So once we have our 5 to 10 rows of waste yarn, get it out of the yarn holder, crank it around twice, and you'll see how it just falls off your machine. once we crank it around. So pause here and crank out all of your tubes and meet me back and we'll look at the layout. So for our layout, we have 6 tubes. We have 4 for the middle. The 2 longest tubes are on the outside. Those are the 250 rows. The 2 inside tubes, that's where your neck hole's gonna be. Those are at the 125. So we have a front and back. And then you have 2 tubes for your arms if you're doing single layer. And them I did for me at 80 rows. So now we need to close our tubes flat. We're gonna do this by slip stitching where we have the waste yarn, and we're going to slip stitch them down closed. So we can start with our neck holes, slip stitch those down, and I'm going to show you how to do that step by step, but we're also going to slip stitch down the top and bottom of the tubes as well on the longer ones. All of these, we're going to slip stitch them down, each one. And again, just for layout, we have our front and back side of our torso tube. Once we mattress stitch them all together, they're going to fold over in half like this, and that makes our front and back side of the torso part of our sweater. And so these are mattress stitched all together, then we will fold it over, and now we have the front and back side of our sweater with this middle part being our neck hole. So just so you can kind of see how that's going to look, the last thing we're going to do is mattress stitch up the side and connect the arms. One last thing as well, when we go to close our tubes like this, we want to make sure the knit side, or what looks like the little V side, is on the outside. So we want to make sure this is facing us. This is the right side of the project. This side here is called the purl side. That's the inside or the wrong side of your project. So just make sure you have it right side facing out. And now we're going to slip stitch closed the torso part of our 4 tubes. So that's the 4 tubes that we made. So here's one side of our tubes, and we have the 2 tail ends of our yarn here. We have the project yarn, and then we have our waste yarn. I like those at the bottom facing me because we want to make sure we close our tubes flat and there's no twist, because we're closing the top and the bottom of our tube. So we want to make sure it's flat and even on both sides. So to do that, you have the tail yarns down towards you, and then remember, we have a 48 needle circular knitting machine, so we have 48 stitches that we can count. And the stitches we're going to pick up is these red stitches that are in between the 2 yellow waste yarn stitches. So that makes it really easy to count when you have a high contrasting waste yarn. So I start down at the bottom where the tail end is, and then I count up one side, so kind of counterclockwise, till I get to 24. So I'm counting these red stitches until I get to 24, because half of 48 is 24. I hold it and then I mark it with a stitch marker, like so. And then I go down to my other side of where my other tail is, which would be the yellow one, because that's the waste yarn, and I count my stitches going from that side up. And again, I should get 24. So count around until you get 24, and it should be side by side. If you end up where the stitch is already marked, you're off by a stitch, so recount. Or if you have a stitch in between your 2 stitch markers, you're off again. You want to make sure they're even and you have the 2 24 stitches marked side by side. So now to slip stitch the tube closed flat, I'm going to zoom in so you can see this a little better. We're going to pick up the red stitches. So you can see there's our project yarn, and then there's yellow yarn in between. That's holding these live stitches, this last row of red, in place so it doesn't unravel. And this waste yarn helps us see which stitches we need to pick up, which is this last row of red that's sandwiched in between the yellow. That's what we're going to pick up. So I like to start with the tail ends of the yarns at the bottom, and then those 2 24 stitches that we marked with the stitch marker, those are going to be our very top, and that's how we know those are the 2 stitches we want to start with. So we flatten the tube out flat without any twisting on both sides. And this is also why it's very important when you crank out your rows that you start and stop at the same needle. So I'm going to remove the stitch markers, and I have them kind of pulled so I can see which ones, I know which are my 2 24th numbered stitches right there. I'm going to pick up my right one with my crochet hook and then pick up my left one. And now I'm going to slip stitch the stitch closest to the hook through this one that's furthest away from the hook. So the first loop goes through the second loop. There's our first slip stitch. Now I'm going to pick up the right next stitch, which would have been like the 23rd stitch on my right side. So pick it up, and we just pick up the red only, and then again slip stitch the first loop through the second loop. So the closest to the hook goes through the second one, furthest away from the hook. Now we go to the left and slip stitch through, then to the right and slip stitch, and then left and right. And so it kind of makes this X or zigzag pattern all the way down. And you want to do this all the way down to the waist yarn. And I'll do this in real time all the way down on this first one so you can kind of see it and get a hang of it. And this is why it's very important to have a high contrasting waist yarn color so you can see the stitches you need to pick up. Because if we skip a stitch, you're going to have a hole, and then when we remove the waist yarn, it's going to unravel that whole row if we don't pick it up and secure it. So you want to take your time at this point, making you pick up all 48 stitches. So you can count this too as you're going down, starting if you're at the 224s at the top, you can count 1, 2, then 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way down to make sure you pick up every single stitch before we remove this waist yarn. And again, I will keep this one at real time so you can follow along with me, so you can see the entire process of closing the tube flat. If you've never made a scarf on a Sentro knitting machine, this is how I like to close the ends of my scarves as well. So we're just going to go back and forth, and you see how I kind of pull the waist yarn with my left hand. And this is just making sure I'm getting the correct red stitch. We want it to be the very last one. And then as we close the tube down, once we get closer to the waist yarn ends, some of the stitches kind of hide down in here because our opening isn't very big. So you just want to take your time and pull it and make sure you're getting every single one of those stitches and you don't miss one. So here we are down at the end. And I kind of uncurl it to make sure I can see all those red stitches, because some can kind of hide down in there and hide under the waist yarn as well. So that's why it's nice to count 2, and then you can make sure you picked them all up. And so we're just getting down to the very end. We have a couple more left. And so I kind of move the waist yarn around to make sure I can find everything. And I'm not missing a stitch. And now they all should be picked up. Do I have one more? Oh, one more. See, one more was kind of hidden there. And you might need to kind of pull it with your fingers so you can get it, because it might be a little bit tight, that stitch, to get it all the way around. Slip stitch the last one through, and now I'm going to end with the project yarn, the tail end of the project yarn. Use it to slip stitch it through the last loop, and then that's going to secure all of your ends together. And you can tie it and then in a knot at this point as well, but now everything is secure. Now before we remove our waist yarn, I kind of pull it and look at it to make sure all these stitches look even, this X or zigzag pattern. If you have a big hole, that means you missed a stitch, and so you want to undo it and go back and make sure you pick up those stitches before we remove our waist yarn. Now it looks like all of the stitches are picked up, so I'm going to remove the waist yarn. You can also do the ravel cord waist yarn, cast on and cast off. I didn't, because there's so many steps to this sweater. I just did the regular waist yarn cast on. I have a video on how to do that as well. But the first side is going to be real easy to undo. We just need to find the end of it right here. And this was the cast off portion, because you just find the end of the yarn, of the waist yarn, the tail end, and it's just going to unravel super easy. And so we just pull it, and it's pretty satisfying to pull it. And I'll speed this up and we'll pull it till it's completely out. And there we go. We have one side of our tubes complete. So you're going to do this on all of the tubes for your torso. The top and the bottom, we're going to stitch the tube down shut. And here's how it will look like when that's done. So now for the other end of your tube, I'm going to speed this up because it's the same exact process. We're going to slip stitch the tube shut, and I do the same thing. I count, I make sure my rows are even. I have 24 on each side with my waste yarn tails at the bottom. And then that way I know my tube won't be twisted, it will be flat. And then we're going to slip stitch it down all the way to the end, just like how we did on the other side. The only difference will be is, since this side is our cast on side, the waste yarn, the yellow yarn, it's actually locked into place. So I'll show you how to remove the waste yarn. I'll do that in real time once I get this all slip stitched closed. So you don't need to cut out your waste yarn. So it's all closed up. Everything's good. So now we need to remove the waste yarn. So this was the cast on part. So since the stitches are locked in, you just need to find the tail end of the waste yarn, and we just need to take it out of the first row of loops. So you just remove it like this for the first row, because if you pull it, it's going to cinch it tight so it doesn't pull off like the cast off part did. So you just kind of unroll it a little bit and then pull out the waste yarn, the tail end, one time around. Once you get it pulled out of the first set of loops on the first row, then you can pull it just like you did on the other end, and the stitches will drop. So that just takes a little bit of time. Again, there's also the ravel cord cast on you can do. I wanted to save a couple extra steps. It doesn't take that long, I don't think, to remove the waste yarn this way. So I didn't want another set of yarn that I had to deal with making the sweater, so I just chose to do it this way. But you can definitely do the ravel cord cast on if you want. So now that's done and it's off, it'll all come out just like the other side did. So that was the two neck pieces that I did, and now we're going to flatten the tops and bottoms of the 4 tubes as well. Once that's all done, now we're going to mattress stitch down from the top down to the neck hole, and then from the other bottom side up to the neck hole, and then again from the top down to the neck hole on the other side, and from the bottom up to the neck hole on that one. And so that will mattress stitch them all down together. So to mattress stitch, you're going to start at the end that has the long tail end of your yarn, and then we're going to pick on each tube. We're going to mattress stitch them together. So you'll see here you have your knit stitches that looks like a little V. We go in between and we pick up the piece of yarn that's in between the knit stitch, or where it comes to the V at the point. We pick up that piece of yarn right here. If you don't have a long enough tail, you can add extra yarn. Just tie a knot, tie it to the end of your project. If you forgot to do that, you can definitely do that as well. But if you have it already hooked on to your tube, that just saves you a step. So as you can see, I'm going up 1 row. So you want to pick the row, and I do it at the outside corner of both of my tubes. And we're going to follow that same row all the way up. So you want to make sure you stay in the same row so you don't twist your stitch. So for the first one, I kind of go up and through the first knit stitch to join them together at the bottom corners. So now it's on my right side, and now we're going to go over to the left tube. And again, we're going to go right under where the V comes together, and we're going to pick up that middle stitch there on the right side. Or it's the left side, I guess. And then now we go back over to the right side up to the next stitch. So you just want to make sure you stay in the same row on each of your tubes. If you jump over to a different row on a tube, you'll start to see it looks like a twisted look. So you just go back and forth, stitch by stitch, all the way up to our neck hole, because we're mattress stitching one of our tubes that was 125 rows that has the neck hole, and then to one of the outer tubes that was 250 rows, and I started at the bottom working up to the neck hole. And we just go back and forth side by side, and once you get a little bit going up, it kind of looks like a corset, or how you kind of lace up a bodice is kind of how it looks like when you're mattress stitching up. And then you can always check your work by pulling on this working yarn, and it should look pretty seamless as they come together. So I'll do a few more and then I'll pull it so you can see what that looks like. And then we're going to mattress stitch everything together. And again, you can just see I'm going back and forth, picking up that inner piece of yarn that's in the between the knit stitch, or where the V point comes together of the knit stitch. And so here's how it kind of looks. And then you can always check your work. And I like to do that every so often. After a few inches, check your work to make sure it's coming together. And it looks nice and it doesn't look like we're twisting or anything, or we jumped over a row as well. If that happens, it's really easy just to undo a few of the stitches to get back on track. So we're going to do this all the way up on our 4 sets of tubes for our torso. So you can pause here and meet me back once you have them mattress stitched together. All right, so now we have our torso tubes mattress stitched together. So it looks like this. So we stitched them all up lengthwise. We left this hole for the neck hole. So we didn't stitch those at all. And then we just mattress stitched down, and then we folded it down in half. So now we have our front and our back side once we fold it down together. Now we're going to mattress stitch up to the side. So to do that, we want to fold the torso in half, and then we're going to mattress stitch up the side of our project. The last thing we're going to do is add on our arm. So we even it up and we put the 2 corners together, and we're going to mattress stitch all the way up to where our arm goes, right here. And just to give you a kind of a visual, here's our tube for our arm. It's going to go right here, and we're going to slip stitch these stitches here, these red stitches that sandwich in between our 2 yellow pieces of waste yarn. We're going to slip stitch it to the row right in here, and we're going to slip stitch it all the way around right here. So just to kind of give you a visual of what we're doing. So once it's on, it's going to look like this when you slip stitch it together. And so I'll show you how to do that step by step coming up next. We'll do the mattress stitch and connecting our arm to the torso body. Okay, so a few things you want to do when you go to mattress stitch down is you want it on a nice flat surface. So I have it on my countertop, so it's nice and flat, and we can even up our sides together. Down here at the bottom, the thing you want to remember is we're mattress stitching clothes are 1 solid tube, that's 250 rows. So you want to make sure on these 2 bottom corner pieces that you are mattress stitching up the same row starting at the bottom all the way up to your shoulder and then all the way back down. You don't want to skip over onto a different row because then it will kind of twist on you again. So you want to make sure you're nice and flat, have everything measured up as good as you can here, because we want to make sure at where this arc goes up, it's the same stitch or the same row. So the first thing I want to do is I want to kind of guesstimate just a little bit where my arm is going to go. So I have it folded in half and I have a pretty good idea where I'm at, but where that bends, I'm going to count again these knit stitches where my shoulder is. And remember, our tube for our arm has 48 stitches that we're going to put onto here. So I'm just counting 24 down, and then I'm going to mark it with a stitch marker. And I like to use the needle for this because I can go into each V of the knit stitch, and if I have to move it, I can just poke in the needle and keep it in there. But I'm going to mark this here, and then I'm going to mark the other side as well. And this is just kind of visual. It's probably not exactly accurate, and you're going to see that once I start slip stitching it together, but I just kind of want to know where to stop. If you go too far when you're mattress stitching up your side, you can always undo a few stitches, but I thought this might just save a few steps by kind of giving a visual of where to stop, and then you can kind of adjust it from there. So here's 24 that I counted, and again, it's not perfect, but it's just kind of giving me a visual of kind of where I want to stop before I start to put on my arm. Lastly, before we start to mattress stitch, we want to make sure we're on the same row of stitches, starting at the bottom, going all the way up and around and back to the end. So we want to make sure we're on the same row and we're not skipping over a row. So to do that, I just take my needle and I start at a row, and I forgot to put a stitch marker. Put a stitch marker where you want to start and just trace up all along with your needle. And then if you need to move it, insert your needle and move it around. And then you can make sure you're going around the same side. So you're hitting both stitch markers, you're in the same row, and you're ending in the same row. So I have a stitch marker here and a stitch marker here. And then I double checked myself one more time to make sure everything is in the same row. So now that I'm confident I'm working on the same row on both sides of my corners, now I'm going to mattress stitch it together. So this, I don't have a long enough tail yarn to mattress stitch up, so I'm just going to connect both sides together with some more yarn, and then we'll knot it together is what we'll essentially do if you don't have a not long enough tail. So we're going to pull it through, and I just left it open, and I have a super long piece of yarn, so I knot it at the end. I just kept it open so I could move it and adjust it if needed. And now we'll do the same thing like how we mattress stitch the torso together. Now, since we're doing it together, we're just going up again into that same knit stitch, all the way up till we get to our stitch markers to about where we think our shoulder or our arm tube is going to attach. And so we're going to mattress stitch up, and then we're just doing each one every other. I don't skip any. I go to the left, and then I go to the stitch on the right, and then back to the left, going into every single stitch. And since we start at the bottom corner, this is making it so we know that we're even up to where we put our arm tube and where we connect it. Now you'll see once I get up there, you'll see my stitch markers are kind of off because my count was off, because those were just a guide. And then once we get this mattress stitched up, we know we're even, and that's when we'll count our 48 stitches again. So we might have to do then a few more mattress stitches to close it all together, but it's just giving us a reference so we don't close it down too much. And again, once we're mattress stitching, it's going to look like that corset or that bodice, like kind of zigzag back and forth, and then you can pull it tight to check your work to make sure you're picking up the correct stitches and you haven't jumped over into a different row. So I'm going to speed this up, and I will meet you back once we get back up to where we're going to connect the arm. Okay, so once you get your side all mattress stitched up, so you can see now how my stitch markers are slightly off, because we've evened ourselves up starting at the corners at the two bottom stitches. We're even there, and we mattress stitched all the way up to the side until we got to our stitch markers. So now that we're here where our armhole is at, here's our neck, here's our armhole, and now we want to count these stitches so we can even it up, and we want 48 stitches to secure our arm to it. And this is essentially the same process that we did to slip stitch our tube close, except for instead of just closing it, we're slip stitching the tube to our opening here. So we're just going to kind of count our stitches to see where we're at, and we want to make sure you're still using the same row that we mattress stitched to connect these stitches to as well here. So I moved my yarn that I was using to mattress stitch out of the way. You want to keep that on there because you're going to have to finish closing up your tube with it once you have your arm connected. But I'm just kind of counting my stitches, see how many I have, and then I'm going to move my stitch markers so we have 48. And so I had to count this a few times, seeing where I needed to start and stop, where my tube would go. I just use my needle right here to kind of mark it, and then I'll move my stitch marker up, and then I recount again. So you're just trying to even up where your 224 stitches will be at the very top. So I'll speed this up, but pretty much it's counting, checking, recounting again. I count a few times just to make sure I have it right. And now we're going to put our tube arm onto the torso. And we're going to use the slip stitch method, and we're going to have the two tail ends closest to us. And again, we're going to pick up the red yarn that's sandwiched in between the yellow waist yarn. So here's my armhole, and I want to make sure I'm using the same row that I have the mattress stitch in, and we're going to pick up that stitch and mattress stitch them together. So I'm going to turn it. So here's like the armpit right here. And here is our tube. And then you want to make sure you're picking up the same stitch. So I pick up this stitch here, right by my tail end of my yarn, pick up the red piece of yarn. So I have that loop on my hook on the right. And now we're going to pick up this inner V stitch. That's the loop we want to pick up, and it's in the same row we were mattress stitching. So we're just going to pick it up right here. That's our next one. So there's our knit stitch. Pick up the inner loop, And then we're going to slip stitch the one closest to the hook through the one furthest away from the hook. There's our first slip stitch, and then we go to the right, slip stitch it through, and then we go to the left, and we just go back and forth again, left to right, and then right to left, slip stitching all the way around the circumference of our arm sleeve. And I'll keep this in real time for a while so you can see that back and forth. But it's really nice. This is what you practice on all your tubes, flattening it. Instead of flattening, we're just doing the circumference. And now we're getting like to the top of our shoulder here. And so since we're doing it in a circle, you kind of will need to move it around like this so you can see all your stitches. And then you just go back, doing again one side, then the other. And we're going to slip stitch this back and forth until we get back down to the tail end of our yarn. And so now I'll speed this up till we get back down to the end. So once you get back down to our tail yarn, we're here. I just have a few more that I might need to do. And again, you want to make sure, since we're slip stitching this, we want to pick up every stitch that has that waste yarn. So when we remove the waste yarn, it doesn't unravel. We want to make sure everyone's picked up and secured. So just kind of take your time while you're looking, make sure you have everything picked up and in place. That one's secured already, so I got that one. So now we just need to use our tail end of our yarn that's connected to our arm sleeve and pull it through, and now everything is secured. So there's still a little bit of a hole in that armpit area, and that's why we still have that yarn connected from our mattress stitch, and we'll just finish mattress stitching up, securing all the yarn together. And then the mattress stitch yarn that I used to go up the side, and then the tail end of the arm sleeve, I tie those together in a knot, and then I weaved in the ends. So here's just that finishing up this hole that we have here. Once the arm sleeve is connected, now we just need to finish mattress stitching up and connecting everything down. And so it just takes a little bit to see which stitches you need to work on, and then it will close up the hole. And so you can see I kind of pull on the yarn so I can see where I need to put up my stitches, because it just kind of gets kind of small to figure out where you need to go to finish the mattress stitch. And the very last one, I put it in again into one of the loops of the arm of my arm sleeve. And now I'm going to tie the two tail ends of the working yard together once everything has been closed up, and I tie it in a knot. Now that your arm sleeve is secure, just double check to make sure all of your stitches have been secured down, and we can remove the waste yarn. Now that your arm sleeve is connected, you'll want to do the same exact process on the other side of your sweater where you connect your arm. So you're going to sew mattress stitch up the side of your tubes together, and then slip stitch on your tube arm to your torso of your shoulder right here. Next, let's finish our sleeves. We need to slip stitch down the live edge of our sleeve here down at the bottom. So we're going to do this with the slip stitch. This is why we wanted a really long tail end left from when we made our tubes and we cranked them out, because we're going to use this to slip stitch it down. So we want to get our crochet hook. I lost my green one for some reason. I have misplaced it. So I have a different crochet hook, but still the same size. So we're going to take the tail end and we're going to use that as our working yarn. And I like to hold my yarn like this. And then we're going to do a slip stitch. This is technically a crochet stitch, but it's a very basic beginner slip stitch, crochet stitch for you. So we have our tail end. Hold that with your left hand and then put your crochet hook through that loop that has that tail end of the yarn. See the loop and how the tail end's connected there? Put your crochet hook through that loop and then through the next loop to the left. So we have 2 loops on our hook, like this. So let me show that to you again. See how our tail end of the yarn is through that loop? So that's on our hook. And now we do the next one over, put that on our crochet hook. 2 loops on our hook. Now we yarn over the tail end of our working yarn, catch it, and pull through both loops. And there's a slip stitch. Now we have 1 loop on the hook. We go through our next loop. 2 loops on the hook, yarn over, pull through 2. Now 1 is left on the hook, do it again, pull through 2. And this is our slip stitch, and we're going to do this all the way around the bottom of our sleeves. And this is securing our stitches so they don't drop. And I'll keep this in real time for you as we go all the way around so you can see how to do this. This might take some practice. If you've messed up or anything, you know, it's really easy. Just frog it, undo, rip it out, just undo the stitches. You just pull on the working end of your yarn. If you missed a stitch or anything like that, and you can start over, no big deal. And then also work on tension. If it seems like your hole is closing really, really tight, you're too tight on your tension, so loosen it up a bit. And this just comes with a little bit of time and practice, but this is a slip stitch is a nice beginner stitch you can do because you have to do something to close the end of your arm. You have to connect those stitches somehow. And so doing it this way gives you a little bit of stretch and keeps the arm opening the same circumference. So I sped it up a little bit because it takes a while to get all the way around, but you're picking up all 48 stitches. So we're back to the front, or back to our beginning, I should say, because we're going around. And now we're just going to now do a slip stitch back through our beginning one. And so we're back to our beginning, and now we're gonna go through one there, yarn over, pull through 2 to connect it, and now continue pulling that loop and your tail end of your working yarn all the way through, and now they're connected and you can knot it down. Just double check that you have connected every stitch, that you've picked them all up, and then we can remove the waste yarn. And your sleeve is done, and you'll do the exact same process on your other sleeve. And here is how the end of your sleeve will look. If you do know how to crochet, you could do like a nice different crochet stitch if you want to. It does curl a little bit, but hopefully when we block it, it will lay nice and flat. So do this on your other sleeve. And next we will work on our neck opening. And we're going to do the same thing like we did at the end of the sleeves. We're going to use the tail end of our working yarn, and we're going to do a slip stitch around our neck. So here's our neck, and I found my crochet hook, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to pick up our stitches, and we're just going to work through the front and do a slip stitch. So we have to poke through and pull through. So poke through, yarn over, pull through 1 and 2. So because we're not picking up an individual stitch, I'm kind of going right below where we flattened our tube. So I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see that. So this is kind of the only difference that we have, is instead of picking up a stitch, we just have to go through both layers, yarn over, pull through the layer, and then yarn over and pull through the loop. And we're going to do this all the way around, and this just creates a nice border. You don't necessarily have to do this part if you don't want to. But I thought it created just a little bit nice of a border for around the neck as well. So this is optional, but it's the same slip stitch that you did on your both sleeves. So I'm going to speed this up and I'll meet you back at the end. Because once we have our neck done, if you've opted to do this part, the last thing we want to do is we want to tie down all of our ends and weave them in. So the one thing you just want to make sure, same for your neck here, is you don't want to be too tight on your tension because you don't want to close up that neck hole because you need to get your head to go through it, right, when you're putting on the sweater. So that's just the one thing. If it seems like it's super tight, take it out and redo it and just loosen up your tension here. So we're just finishing up, going around. And once we get back to where we began, you just slip stitch them together and pull the tail end of your working yarn all the way through. And so pull it through as our last slip stitch that we're back at the beginning. And I had a lot of yarn, so we'll pull it through. And now I did have a couple extra tails up there from when I did the tube, when I cranked out the tube. I'm just going to tie them down together, and then we will weave in our ends and tie everything off. And then that will be our completed No Frills Sweater. So here I am just knotting everything down, making sure it's secure, and then we're weaving into the ends. If it's a part where it's the double layer, you could just put it in between the two layers and cut off any excess. Where you crocheted any, like around the sleeves, you can weave in those ends and cut off any extra. Lastly, what you'll want to do once you have all the tail ends of your yarn secured and weaved in, then you can block the project. I will have a video, like it's a sped up video of me blocking the sweater. Thank you so much for watching. Like and follow for more tutorials, and happy crafting, everybody.